If you invested in Tesla when it was just a dollar, if you invested in Tesla when it was in the pennies, you made life-changing money off of Tesla. So there was opportunity to be had here. But Elon's become a different person over the course of this company. Over the time of this company, he's became very wealthy because he was a primary holder in Tesla, and it did go insane. He made a great car. It made him a lot of money, but the growth engine kind of ran out, and it seems like he's fleeing over to SpaceX, which Tesla has a forward PE ratio of 212. Okay. This stock is going to get crushed at the SpaceX IPO. A lot of Tesla investors are going to move money into SpaceX, if I had to guess, because there's just not much value in Tesla. I would say there's no value in Tesla. The stock's been flat for around 5 years now, so there's not a lot going on. And Elon always promises the future over and over again. And Elon has this type of, leadership over companies where a 212 forward PE ratio is not insane. His company is not growing really at all, but he has a 212 forward PE. I mean, that's insane. Okay, but Elon Musk gets away with it because of what he says over and over in the future. But money is literally going to be forced into SpaceX, so this is something to think about as well. There's going to be massive forced buying. We see once SpaceX lists on the NASDAQ, funds that track these indexes will be legally required to buy billions of dollars worth of SpaceX shares to maintain their tracking weights. Fast-tracked inclusion, so we see rules have been changed where SpaceX can be acquired just after 15 trading days into the NASDAQ 100, which seems like that's probably going to happen. Also, some public float alterations. Index providers like NASDAQ and FTSE Russell are modifying their conditions regarding the minimum percentage of company stock that must be publicly available. So they could include SpaceX very shortly after their IPO. The current SpaceX revenue does come mostly from Starlink, but a crazy stat that Elon Musk pointed out is that SpaceX IPO targets 28.5 trillion total addressable market, TAM, mission to make life multiplanetary and understand true nature of the universe. So is that something you can put a price tag on? I don't think so. A $28.5 trillion total addressable market would be definitely, game changing. This would make the company possibly worth $1.5 trillion at IPO, but do I think that's legit? Probably not. And I don't think this makes sense right now, but the space ETF is up 150% this year. You got to think there is a lot of hype in space. There's a lot of things that space could be great for, and I definitely see the side of that where space could house multiple data centers, an enormous amount of data centers, and I could see that being the future for the economy of America and a lot of money being made there. But will that happen in the coming years? I'm not sure. I think it kind of might be a pipe dream in the foreseeable future, but it could excel and be a big thing very fast. But how do you play the IPO? So how are you going to play the SpaceX IPO without per se gambling? I think you could easily gamble on any IPO that comes out, but there's ways that you can move around that. So one way is buy and sell quick, and then the other way is buy after the drop and the hype dies off. So SpaceX, if I had to take a wild guess, I say that, for example, this company right here, ARM Holdings, this is one that IPO'd at $51. They initially spiked, right after their IPO, 20%. Easy 20% gain. You could have held the stock right at IPO, before IPO, bought it for that, and then sold it for a 20% gain in a day. That sounds great to me, and I'm sure it was up even more, during the day, but this is just what it shows on Robinhood in the max all-time chart. The stock sold off after this, melted up in the end. So the stock sold off, went back down to $51, went below $51, probably scared a lot of people off, but it had time to settle at that low price, and then eventually, this is now over $200 stock, so you would have 4x your money very fast in just, a little bit under 3 years. So pretty good investment, if you ask me. But how I'm playing the IPO is I'm trying to buy SpaceX for what it's worth, right? Their initial value, which it's not really worth that, but we'll say that. So I want to buy SpaceX for their initial value, and then we see right here brokerage penalties. Brokerages like Robinhood and Fidelity heavily discourage flipping, selling shares within 15 to 30 days of the IPO. And doing so can result in a temporary ban. So I hope that I don't get that banned, but I'm also, not that worried about that. I think that if I do invest in this IPO, it's something where I kind of want to make the money just initially off the jump, and it's not something that I really want to hold for a very long time, and I'd be fine just selling it right after that and not getting in another IPO for a long time. But if the valuation looks attractive and it's a cheap stock, which I don't think is going to happen, then of course I'll buy back in. But I don't think SpaceX is a good long-term buy at this valuation. I don't think there's any world where this company is worth this much. I could be wrong because, as I write here, space plus Elon is the definition of a hype stock. This could be, the biggest hype stock of all time. It's probably going to be because, you have Elon's name, you have his track record with Tesla, you see Tesla shareholders. That's a whole different video, but there is reason where I could see the stock valued at what it is and it actually make a little bit of sense just for the fact that Tesla has had this kind of valuation, Elon's had this kind of valuation, and then you mix in AI, you mix in space. There's a big multiple that goes behind that. So it could happen, but I'm a long-term investor, but if there is money to be made, I'm there. So I think there's money to be made here. I think this is a pretty easy 100% gain if you do get in on SpaceX from the ground floor. And obviously, I'm not a day trader. I'm not really even a swing trader. I have made some swing trades on the channel. I hope you guys took that Dutch Bros trade. That was an easy 10% gain. But you want to have your stop loss too. So if you don't want to be a long-term holder of SpaceX, like for example, address your risk tolerance. But for me, I'd say, I'm going to buy SpaceX before the IPO. If they IPO and the stock goes crashing, maybe I have a 20% stop loss and a 50% take profit. So my risk ratio, I'd want to have that maybe around 2 to 1. So, a little bit higher than that, 2.5 to 1. So that's something you got to take into consideration for yourself, but that would be my risk to reward ratio on something like this. Maybe even 100% gain, 40% loss, maybe just really go all out there with that. But it could even go up 300% at IPO. It could go up 400%. You never know. But with the $1.5 trillion valuation, I think 100% is probably, some of the most you're going to see it go up. Because if this gets, if this is the biggest market, there's just a lot of things that wouldn't make sense if this company initially, 4x and became an $8 trillion company and they were the most, the highest valued company in the world above NVIDIA with a net loss on the 2025 year. So a lot of things in the air, but I do think that there is money to be made here. Let's get right into the video.
SpaceX taking a very big step towards what's almost certain to be the biggest IPO ever. And I want to get straight over to Leslie Picker. She's got the perspective. She's been going through all of it. What do you see as the biggest highlights, Leslie?
Hey, Andrew, good morning. Yeah, after being filed confidentially, SpaceX flipped its S1 public yesterday, giving a long-awaited peek into the 24-year-old company's financials. SpaceX generated $18.7 billion in revenue last year. That was up 33% from the prior year. In the 3 months through March, SpaceX generated $4.7 billion in revenue and a net loss of $4.3 billion, nearly the same.
Just like the numbers we went over, and look at the long-term debt. It's almost $30 billion. Their long-term debt is more than what they made in revenue just in 2025. It's pretty much double, so keep that in mind.
Same size. The company also showed long-term debt of $29 billion. Still, SpaceX is seeking a valuation around $1.5 trillion, and that's on some of the conservative side, based on some of the sources I've spoken with. That implies a multiple of 80 times last year's revenue. But there appears to be more growth coming down the pike. SpaceX said that Anthropic will pay $1.25 billion.
This is a common thing with Elon Musk too. He says, oh, next year we're gonna have this. You see it with Tesla over and over again, which has a 220 forward PE. Keep that in mind. But you see it over and over. Next year we're gonna have self-driving cars. The year after that, we're gonna unleash our new model. So there's a lot of things that he says that sometimes come true, sometimes don't. But you got to take this with a grain of salt. Okay.
Dollars per month through May of 2029 is part of a compute deal that was announced earlier this month, and the capacity will ramp over the next few months at a reduced fee, and this agreement can be terminated by either side with about 90 days notice. Well, most of SpaceX's revenue currently comes from Starlink, satellite business. It says in the prospectus that it has, quote, the largest actionable total addressable market, or TAM, in human history, which it quantifies at $28.5 trillion. And the biggest component to that TAM, the company says, is from AI, which it estimates at $26.5 trillion, and that would span infrastructure, consumer subscriptions, digital advertising, and enterprise applications. So this IPO, like many of the smaller listings that came before it, will hinge on the validity, or at least the investors' perceived validity, of these big dreams. Andrew.
Yeah, this is a very dream-driven IPO, I think. Coming out of the gates at $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion, and having a revenue of not even $20 billion in a single year and putting yourself, it just doesn't make a lot of sense.
So there's a whole bunch of other things in there, to me, that were fascinating beyond just the profits and losses, or in this case, still the losses, but just what the revenue trajectory looks like. The idea of retail investors getting access early is fascinating, and I think it's a big experiment. I'm curious what you're.
This is great for me and you watching this video. We're going to get early access as a retail investor. And I still think there's money to be made on SpaceX, like I had on the video on the main channel. But is there a lot of money to be made? I think in the beginning, maybe, if you get in at the right price, there's always money to be made in any single stock. But as a long-term buy, just from the IPO, I don't know.
Hearing on that front, there's the governance question. This is a company that is genuinely going to be controlled by Elon Musk, so much so that technically the company doesn't even need to have independent directors, and what you think that ultimately means. What are you hearing on those fronts?
In terms of retail, I was told that it could be up to 30% of allocations could be retail, and they list a variety of brokerages that they'll be doing that through. Morgan Stanley is directing a lot of this program. Of course, they own E-Trade as well, so you can expect that to be a key component. I had also heard that retail across the pond in maybe the UK and Canada and Japan would be a key component of this as well, kind of garnering retail support, not just here in the US, but also abroad. In terms of the governance, very unique here, not unlike things we've seen at other Elon Musk companies. I believe he'll have about 85% of the control after this company goes public. We should get more details about governance too as the filing gets amended over the course of the next few weeks. That's something that has been out in the press for a while, just the unique governance structure and the ability to remove Musk. It's something that some of the pension funds have really balked at. They're not buyers of IPOs, but they're buyers of indexes. And if this company is included in the index, they could be essentially forced owners of.
This company could be included in the index very fast. Is it going to be a huge portion of the index? No. But it could be included in, the NASDAQ 100. It could be included in triple Qs. There's a lot of funds that might be forced to buy some SpaceX stock.
SpaceX. And so they said that the governance structure that had been out there in reports is something they were not fond of. Whether it's enough to really, prevent this company from filling its order book remains to be seen, but probably unlikely just given the nature that this is SpaceX, this is Musk, and people have really gotten used to that.
Leslie, let me ask you this about the retail piece of it. There's part of me that loves it in that, you get the idea of democratizing an IPO and people getting access at least earlier than some of the institutions might otherwise, and allocating it that way can be seen as a positive. At the same time, I think there's been a question about whether you think retail investors ultimately stay in. Maybe, do they have diamond hands, if you will? And the reason I ask is Bill Ackman's IPO recently, he actually approached it by trying to offer more shares early on to retail investors. And they ultimately flipped it very quickly, and it wasn't positive. And so I just wonder what you're hearing on that front.
Yeah, no.
I think retail investors are going to tend to flip this one very quickly as well. Because, you kind of, as someone that doesn't have as much money as these institutions, you got to allocate your money a little bit more sparingly. So, you get the stock and then you make a little bit of profit, get rid of it. It's a pretty good trade-off.
You're spot on there. And the old school playbook for IPOs, especially big IPOs, was to really lock up a concentrated book of allocations with long-term holders that the bankers can trust and that they know won't flip it. Usually hedge funds were deprioritized. Retail was absolutely deprioritized in big listings like this. So 30% would absolutely be much larger than is typical for a deal of this size. And based on what I've heard, there is, of course, the risk of them flipping. On the flip side, I think there's this idea that retail owns a lot of Tesla, and therefore, it would make sense to extend that to SpaceX. But to your point, with these...
I think Tesla stock is going to drop pretty big when SpaceX IPOs because all the money that is going to be put into that, with the hopes, I made a bunch of money with Tesla, let's do the same thing with SpaceX. Yeah.
We don't know what the float size will be quite yet, but based on the numbers that I've heard, somewhere between 50 to 75 billion. And then if the, valuation is, say, upwards of 1.5 trillion, you're looking at a really, really small float. And when you have a supply-demand dynamic like that, you do risk additional volatility, especially if you don't have as great of a sense of the trustworthiness of the people who bought in at the IPO.
So really good video right there. Lots of information on SpaceX, and gives you a lot on what the company actually does and how much money they're making and the valuation that Elon Musk thinks is deserving for them. So that's all I have for today's video, guys. If you did enjoy, be sure to smash that like button. Also subscribe to the channel. Really appreciate the support. I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.